Cybernator busted out of its mech suit and onto your Super NES back in 1992. Developed by NCS Corp and published by Konami, Cybernator seemingly came out of nowhere for us US gamers, but was actually part of the Assault Suit series of games that spanned more than a decade's worth of consoles in Japan. Sadly though, most of those games were rarely localized for the US, and even when they were never directly referenced as a series. In fact, Cybernator is a direct prequel to the only other Assault game that came to the US, that being Target Earth for the Sega Genesis. Still though, the act of getting into a giant mech and blowing shit up is usually universally awesome. So was Cybernator good enough to stand on its own for us folks in the West, even without the Assault Suit lineage in tow? Or was this yet another case of an incomprehensible game series that was best left over in Japan? Well, strap yourself into your favorite 50-foot tall mech, because we're about to see if Cybernator crushes the competition under its massive metal foot. Start up Cybernator and you're treated to what has to be one of the more in-depth storylines for a Super NES game. Throwing things at you like military drama, wars over dwindling fossil fuels, and more than enough political intrigue to fill an episode of House of Cards, Cybernator definitely thinks it has a story to tell. And while it's not anything that's going to make you want to look up a plot synopsis after you beat it, it's worth mentioning for just how few Super NES games attempted a more adult-oriented plot. This certainly isn't another bright and colorful mascot platformer here, as Cybernator's world is a bleak sci-fi setting, and the plot goes out of its way to tell a more mature story from beginning to end. It's just too bad that it seems to like its storytelling a bit too much, but we'll get into that a little later. Once you make it past all the story scenes and mission briefings, you're literally thrust into what looks like your standard 2D action game. You play as a soldier piloting a giant mech, with your goal being to make it to the end of each stage to fight a boss and move on. If that sounds familiar, then congratulations, you've probably played a video game before. But once you actually start playing, you'll see that Cybernator isn't quite as standard as it may first seem. For one, your mech feels and controls like the giant heavy robot it is. Moving around in Cybernator will definitely take some practice, as your slow, lumbering mech isn't quite the super agile platform character that you might be used to. The result is a slower-paced game that requires a bit more strategy than just running headfirst into things, since if you do that, you'll be at the continue screen in short order. Jumping also takes some getting used to, as getting around the large multi-path levels feels about how it should if a 100-ton robot decided to suddenly jump around it. You do at least get a booster to help you get higher than the 7 feet or so that you can jump, so you'll need to get used to using that to get to where you need to go. You also get a super awkward thruster dash that propels your character forward or backward for a second or two, which is usually best used to retreat from battles that aren't going your way or getting past annoying traps. For the most part though, it's fun to pilot your mech around each level, even if it can occasionally be a bit clumsy. You do at least get a decent arsenal to do battle with. At first you start off with a rapid-fire Vulcan cannon that'll probably be your go-to weapon for the majority of the game. You also start off with a punch that's good to use for enemies that like to use shields, but it's generally useless for the rest of the game. Over the course of the game you'll find more weapons to use if you explore, including missiles and a laser cannon later in the game. You can also find weapon power-ups in each stage as well, allowing you to level up each weapon individually to make them more powerful. Unfortunately, they don't drop too often, so you'll need to decide on which weapon you want to keep powering up, leaving other weapons less powerful. And much like controlling your mech, using your weapons will take a bit of practice, since Cybernator allows you to completely control where you want to shoot, independent of moving around. This can feel super clumsy at first, but you eventually get used to aiming around the screen. You can also lock the position of your gun by holding down the L trigger, which is an absolute must if you want to beat most bosses. That's really about all the help the game's going to give you though, and the rest is going to be left up to you to break through the enemy lines. As mentioned before, the levels in Cybernator feature more than a few different paths to make your way to the end. It's not exactly a maze or anything, but you'll usually find multiple ways around each level. If you take the time to fully explore the level, you'll be able to make your own path through the stage that benefits you the most with weapon and health drops that may not be in other areas of the stage. Some stages even feature open exploration, forcing you to find a particular way to the next part of the stage. Combine that with the occasional vertical shooter stage, and some not very fun zero-gravity sections where your mech just kind of bounces all over the screen, and you've got a really good variety of levels. Even the bosses are pretty great, featuring huge sprites that can fill the entire screen, and some that even feature secondary objectives besides just killing them. If there's one area where Cybernator really excels, it's in the stages and the variety they throw at you. Every stage feels unique, and usually has some neat one-off gimmick to throw in. You definitely won't be feeling like you're doing or seeing the same thing over and over in Cybernator. While Cybernator is a pretty great mech game, it does have its fair share of problems. The biggest being the story itself. Well, not so much the actual story, just the way it's presented. As mentioned before, Cybernator's story was a refreshing change of pace from the rest of the Super NES library, but the game goes way overboard with it. Having cutscenes and pre-mission briefings are all fine, but Cybernator seems to want to add a cinematic feel to the game with dialogue that pops up throughout the stage itself. And I'm not talking about a bit of text here and there while you play either. No, we're talking about some pretty long interruptions that actually stop the game dead cold in its tracks to throw out a wall of text at you. And for a game this focused on fast action, having the game randomly pause right in the thick of battle is jarring to say the least. At its worst, it can actually affect gameplay, as you struggle to follow through with what you were trying to do before the game decided to conveniently pause for more needless text. The rest of the time, the seemingly endless dialogue pauses are just incredibly annoying, especially if you could care less about the plot. Sadly, this is something that goes throughout the entire game, and never stops getting in the way of what should otherwise be a great action game. At the end of the day, Cybernator was still an amazing find for any of us that was lucky enough to rent or buy it without knowing anything more about it than just blow stuff up with giant robots. Surprisingly enough though, that's all most of us needed. And thanks to its strangely in-depth for a Super NES game plot, it ended up having a lot of fans that would later go on to seek out the other games in the series. And even if you're not interested in its overly convoluted plot and can look past the constant annoying story interruptions, you'll get a really great action game here, complete with some of the best graphics the Super NES can spit out. Hell, even just getting a good mech game in the US was a treat for those of us that sat patiently through dozens of cartoony mascot platform games for something a bit more adult. So if you ever see Cybernator somewhere for a decent price, definitely pick it up. It's one of, if not the best mech game for the Super NES, and one that'll make you want to suit up for it over and over again. Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers fell out of a monster truck made out of a tin can and onto your NES back in 1990. Rescue Rangers were already riding high on the popularity of their cartoon series by the same name, so it was an obvious decision to bring them home to the NES for us ADD-addled children that couldn't sit still long enough to watch an entire episode before we were off playing video games anyway. Rescue Rangers, the game, is also part of the legendary run of Capcom Disney games that they developed for the NES, and was one of their earliest releases. So does Rescue Rangers bring all of the fun and great gameplay of those later Capcom NES games? Or was this one thrown out as a money grab to us kids that just didn't know any better? Well, put away your favorite gadget fanfiction, because we're about to see if the Rescue Rangers can solve this mystery. Get the game up and running and you can choose to play as either Chip or Dale, and then get a brief cutscene about a missing kitten and how only the Rescue Rangers are awesome enough to take on such a harrowing case. Once you're into the game, you're met with a side-scrolling platformer you could probably see coming from a mile away before you even put the game in your NES. And while it may in fact look like a standard platformer, which it mostly is, the game does have a few things that makes it stand out. For one, Chip and Dale can't directly attack enemies, so sadly there's no chipmunk fisticuffs to be found here. And even jumping on top of enemies will always result in you losing a heart in the process. Instead, Chip and Dale can pick up the various boxes and crates that are scattered around each stage. Picking one up has them doing their best Mario 2 impression, as you can now fling what you picked up straight ahead or straight above you. Thankfully, there are boxes and crates lying around everywhere, so you're rarely left empty-handed. Most enemies go down in 1 or 2 hits, but it can still be intense trying to run and grab that next crate before you take damage. You can also use the crates as a one-hit shield if you duck while you're carrying one, which can really come in handy in the later stages. Besides the whole box flinging thing though, Chip and Dale really doesn't have much else of note, but that's okay since the game is still really fun to make your way through either by yourself or cooperatively with a friend. After you've mastered the art of crate throwing, you'll find that what Chip and Dale lack in innovative gameplay, it more than makes up for it with some really great stages. You navigate around the world using a Mario 3 style map that allows you to choose your path on your way to the main boss. Each stage has its own distinct look and feel, with most having unique obstacles in gameplay, like turning off water faucets, or using crates to flip switches. Still though, there are some things that occasionally disappoint about the stages, like when Gadget comes up before this stage and tells you that she's thrown in a boat for you to navigate the level with. So you spend the entire stage thinking you're going to get this cool boat area, and all it ends up being is a tiny boat that you just jump in and ride for like 10 feet and jump off. definitely not worth the build-up for just that. Each stage also comes with their own unique boss, and none are very hard at all. Just grab the red ball that's lying around and fling it at them, while you dodge whatever they're throwing at you. It's cool that each one is usually unique and does different stuff, but they're all usually so easy that you'll kill them before you even get a chance to appreciate it. Beat the boss and it's time to move on to the next level to rinse and repeat throughout the game's 11 or so stages. Admittedly, the game isn't very long, but it at least stays fun throughout and gets decently challenging toward the end, though you'll probably still wish there were more to it when those credits start rolling. Overall, Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers is a fun, quick playthrough. It may not live up to the later Capcom Disney games, including its own sequel that came out a few years later and is a much more polished and lengthier game. But its first outing is still really fun, and one of the better co-op games you can find on the NES. Rescue Rangers is personally my favorite of those old Capcom Disney games, but that's more due to nostalgia than actually comparing it to something like DuckTales. But I still think it's more than worth your time and money if you can find it somewhere for like $5 or less. There's definitely a ton of fun to be had with Rescue Rangers, just don't expect it to be much more of a challenge than sitting through one of the cartoon episodes. Kyle Petty's No Fear Racing hit every single wall on the track and then slammed onto your Super NES back in 1995. Developed by Leland Entertainment Media and published by Williams in the US, No Fear Racing was poised to be the stock car racing game that the Super NES was sorely lacking. Featuring the official licensing of none other than NASCAR legend Kyle Petty, it looked like fans of NASCAR, and stock car racing in general, could finally get their hands on the type of racing that was very rarely represented back then. So was No Fear Racing worth the wait? Or was this just another crappy racing game with some famous guy plastered on the front of it? Well, put your favorite flame retardant racing suit on, because we're about to see if No Fear Racing can take the checkered flag. Start up No Fear Racing and you're met with the standard assortment of racing game modes, including a full season to compete in, a single race option, and even a track editor that was fairly rare to see in a racing game at the time. Whether you choose season mode or single race, you'll get to customize your car a bit before heading out onto the track. You can use the cash you've earned to upgrade stuff like tires, suspension, and even your very own crew chief. Slap on a few upgrades and then it's time to get out onto the track to experience the true thrill of stock car racing, or at least that's what you hope to do. Once you're out on the track, the racing itself feels kinda weird and disconnected from the track, but there's a good reason for that, which we'll get into soon enough. Your car just seems to careen all over the place, but at least it's playable enough to get the hang of and start passing cars soon enough without smashing into too many walls. Besides relying on your natural ability to race against opponents using just the gas and brake pedals, you'll also get help in the form of nitrous for a serious speed boost. Activating the nitrous sends your car way off into the screen, making it even harder to tell when you need to turn your car before hitting yet another wall. If you run out of nitrous or take too many wall hits, you'll have to attempt to head into the pits to fill up and repair your car. I say attempt because just getting into that damn pit area is almost impossible, even if you slow down to a crawl. Thankfully, even if you can't make it into the pits, you'll have a few pickups lying around the track to help you out, along with things like oil hazards to slow you down. That is, you would be able to use and dodge this stuff if it didn't come up so fast on the screen that you'll never be able to see it before it's right in front of your car. Keep sliding around the track like a madman and you'll eventually either finish the race or turn the game off in a fit of frustration. And while all of that may in fact sound like a mostly functional racing game, I can assure you that No Fear Racing is anything but, as it has a ton of annoying problems that we could probably spend way too much time talking about. From crappy controls, atrocious graphics, and music so bad that it's actually turned off by default when you start the game, No Fear Racing seemingly has it all. But by far the biggest sin the game commits is the racing and tracks itself. While the game may initially look like it has some cool Super FX style 3D graphics from looking at the back of the box, that idea is tossed right out the window as soon as the game starts moving. Remember that whole thing about how your car feels disconnected from the track? Well, that's because it kinda is. Essentially, all the car sprites in the game are sitting on top of a pre-rendered slideshow that's continuously generated based on what chunk of track is coming up next. It's kinda hard to explain, but basically imagine drawing out super simple parts of a racetrack, like a straightaway, a left curve, and a right curve, and then just placing the same drawings in order as needed over and over again. Yes, every track in No Fear Racing is the same 5 or 6 track segments repeated continuously to give give you the illusion of racing around a track. The racing here actually has more in common with a PC game called Mega Race, as it used the same idea of moving your car sprite around on top of a pre-rendered track. And while Mega Race was just as shallow and boring as No Fear Racing is, Mega Race at least ran decently smooth and looked great for the time. Two things that No Fear Racing is nowhere close to accomplishing. The end result, as you may have guessed, is that every race is insanely repetitive, as you make your way around the same track segments so many times that everything just starts to blend in together. And thanks to a frame rate so low that it actually caused me to get tunnel vision the second my car started moving, the sense of speed is also nowhere to be found. It all adds up to produce a completely boring racing game that's little more than just pressing left or right on the controller when needed, with almost zero challenge besides trying not to run into walls. Yes, No Fear Racing is baby's first racing game, and I guess if you're not expecting much more than that, then you may have some fun with what No Fear Racing has to offer. The idea of just how simplistic things are in No Fear Racing is hammered home even further when you go into the aforementioned track editor, where you're met with an absolute bare-bones editor that's only capable of laying down those same track parts that you see in the official tracks. Simply use the controller to guide the track where you want it to go, and then connect it back around to the starting section to create a fully functioning track. Afterwards, you can choose the weather or time of day for your track, toss in some hazards and power-ups on the road, and that's really about all you can do with it. While the track editor might have been a cool little extra in a more fleshed out racing game, you're just making the same tired tracks that you instantly got bored racing on in the main game. So there's no real reason to make a custom track other than just to maybe make the worst possible design you can imagine and then force a friend to play it to at least get some enjoyment out of the game. At the end of the day, it's shocking to look back on Kyle Petty's No Fear Racing and think that this was considered okay to toss out on shelves for stupid kids like me to buy or rent in the hopes of finally getting a true NASCAR-style game. At its best, No Fear Racing is at least playable. I can definitely confirm you can accelerate a stock car around a track and pass other cars, even if it's no fun at all doing so. The included season mode will take up a good chunk of time to finish if you enjoy torturing yourself, and afterwards you can always go into the track editor to make your own abominations to further extend the game. Unfortunately, that's about where all the positives this game may have had ends, as the rest of the game manages to slam into a wall at full speed and then explode into a fiery inferno. It looks awful, controls worse, and the racing itself is so overly simplistic that it would be more at home on a Tiger Electronics handheld game, rather than sitting on the shelf as a full-priced game for the Super NES. So no, I don't recommend that anyone play Kyle Petty's No Fear Racing, since there are far better racing games out there for the Super NES. And for us kids that were looking for an awesome NASCAR racing game at the time, well, we just had to keep waiting, since No Fear Racing was lapped before it even started the race. Contra exploded out of a giant alien carcass and onto your NES back in 1988. Developed and published by Konami, Contra for the NES was based on the arcade game of the same name, though it's not a direct port by any means. In an age where it was more than enough just to dump an arcade game onto the NES and call it a day, Konami went the extra mile for the NES version of Contra, adding in several stages and bosses that weren't in the arcade version. The end result is the Contra we all know and love that became the blueprint for any future run-and-gun action game released afterward. It's an all-time classic for sure, but is Contra still worth playing today even with multiple sequels that refined and made the game better? Well, grab your favorite spread gun, because we're about to see if Contra can still dish out the fun and difficulty all these years later. Load the game up and you're instantly tossed into the action, and thankfully it won't take too long to figure out what the hell's going on. You play as either Bill or Lance depending on the number of players, and it's your job to run to the right and kill anything that's in your path. The B button fires your weapon, and the A button makes your character do that super cool spinning jump thing that only Contra guys can do. Seriously, don't actually try it at home. Master the art of jumping and shooting, and you're ready to face anything Contra has to throw at you, which is mostly going to be aliens shooting at you from everywhere on the screen, so you're going to need something a little bit better than that crappy default weapon to shoot back at them. Thankfully, you won't be stuck with that standard gun for too long, as pods will soon start flying onto the screen. Shoot the pods and you get one of several weapon power-ups from it, including machine guns, lasers, and the all-powerful spread shot. Generally, anything's going to be better than your default gun, so don't be afraid to grab the different types of weapons that drop out of the pods, as they all have their own strengths and weaknesses, though you'll probably just end up sticking to the spread gun because it's so damn fun to use. In fact, all of the shooting and action Contra is just really fun. It feels great to jump around the screen and shoot stuff, and thanks to the variety in weapons, it never gets old. Thankfully, Contra's stages are just as fun and varied as the action is. Most of the stages are your standard run-and-gun variety, but the game does a great job of mixing stuff up to keep things interesting throughout the entire game. Every stage seems to have its own unique challenge, along with the enemies that populate the stage. For example, Stage 2 has you making your way through an alien base from a completely different perspective. You sit at the bottom of the screen here, and have to shoot the various orbs on the doors to blow open the wall and continue on. Other stages have their own sets of traps and hazards to contend with, like this military vehicle from the snow stage that slowly inches toward you with a giant spike shield, as you have to relentlessly jam on the fire button to take him down before it smashes you into the wall. Or even the flames from this stage that you have to carefully navigate through to avoid being burned to a crisp. It also helps that besides the two base stages, every stage looks completely different, and usually have multiple paths to make your way through. Overall, you won't be seeing the same things over and over much at all in Contra, and it goes a long way in making you want to beat the current stage just to see what crazy stuff's gonna be in the next one. Of course, we can't talk about Contra without mentioning the bosses, and they don't disappoint. While that first stage boss isn't exactly mind-blowing, things start to get a lot more interesting as the game gets going. Most are giant screen-sized monstrosities that'll be hurling multiple things at you to stop your progress. And while you're not going to need any sort of strategy guide on how to beat these guys, their patterns and AI at least make them fun to learn and master as you pelt them over and over with bullets. Sadly, their gargantuan size usually means their mobility is extremely limited, if any. So don't expect anything that does more than just kind of slowly lumber around the screen at you. But Contra isn't really going for multi-stage boss battles here. Instead, it's all about size and spectacle, and at least many of the bosses are still really cool to this day despite their tendency to stay in one place. I still remember the first time Red Falcon scrolled onto the screen in the last stage, since I'm pretty sure I almost pissed myself at the horrible slug thing that was staring me down. Contra's bigger-than-life bosses would continue to be a mainstay of the series for years to come, and it's great that the first game here really nailed what future games would continue to perfect. If there's one thing you could knock Contra for, it's the sheer difficulty of the game. No, it's not super cheap or difficult for the sake of being difficult. It's just hard, really hard. It's so hard that there's not too many people out there that have ever beat it without resorting to using the famed Konami code for those precious extra lives it gives you. By default, the game gives you a few lives and a few continues to make it through the entire game. Use up your continues and it's game over. For most people, they've used up their entire allotment of lives and continues by the end of Stage 3, and it only gets harder from there. The amount of memorization you have to do to make it through the entire game without the Konami code is brutal. It's a really daunting task, and one reason why it took me years to ever beat it without the Konami code is help. Still though, it's incredibly rewarding to make it further than you did last time, and it's always fun to come back a little later after you've cooled down and try again. It's definitely hard, but it's the good kind of hard, if that makes any sense. By now, we all know how this story ends, since Contra has gone on to be an all-time classic NES game that defined an entire genre for years to come. Contra is the prototypical action game, and it can still be played and enjoyed now just as much as it could in 1988. I mean, who didn't really see that coming? And while I could sit around and gush about why Contra is so great for far longer than most sane people should, its significance to me goes a bit deeper than just being a really great game. Contra was actually the first game I ever bought with my own money that I saved up, which is a fairly big deal for an 8-year-old spending more than $10 on a single purchase. Thankfully, that purchase provided dozens and dozens of hours of hair-pulling tough love over the years, especially when I finally beat it and damn near gave everyone in the house a heart attack as I ran through every room screaming in excitement. And thanks to its co-op gameplay, it even provided some great memories of me and my dad playing together most nights after school. Contra is great on its own, but having those memories attached to it puts it in a place few games will ever get to with me, and that's what makes it so easy for me to recommend it to anyone who wants to play it these days. So grab a copy of Contra and start shooting your way through Red Falcon's armies. It's everything a great action game should be, and as far as I'm concerned, will always be the best.